Hey everybody, really excited to have this big crew joining us today for our introduction to VMware Cloud on AWS. We're going to kick this thing off. So we called this VMware Cloud on AWS for newbies. So we're going to cover this right from the beginning here, really dive in right from the ground floor here and introduce everybody to all the awesome stuff VMware Cloud on AWS has to offer. So I'm Matt Wallace. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Faction. We're one of the kind of leading MSPs dealing with VMware Cloud on AWS. Been excited to be part of this journey with VMware since kind of middle of 2017. And I'm joined today by Jason Crandall, who's a Senior Systems Engineer from VMware. Thanks for joining us, Jason.
Absolutely. Well, glad to be here. So for those that don't know, I'm Cloud Solution Engineer for VMware Cloud on AWS inside VMware, and Faction is one of the partners I support. Pleasure to be with you all today.
Yeah. Always nice to drag you in for more webinars.
Right.
So just to kind of do a little high-level overview of what we're going to cover today, we've got overview of VMware Cloud on AWS right from the top. We're going to talk about how it's built, attributes of the service. We're going to go through use cases. We're going to talk about pricing models, right? How is VMware on AWS sold and operated? What does that mean to you in terms of buying it? We'll get into the real technical details here. We're going to cover some really notable, interesting roadmap items as well. All right, I'm going to kick off one more poll here before we kind of dive into the meat of the action. It was interesting too with the first poll, we discovered that a majority of you attending are actually getting an introduction to VMware Cloud on AWS for the first time, which is great because I think this is like spot on basically with where we are. This is definitely our kind of introduction and 101 material. So welcome, you came to the right place. We got a great set of info for you today. You're going to come away knowing a lot more than you did before we started. As a kind of bonus reward for joining us today, we have put together a VMware Cloud on AWS cheat sheet for you. This is great. It's going to tell you a lot of little details in a nutshell, so that you can print this and stick it on your desk or hang it in the office or just keep a PDF. But lots of useful information kind of packed into a small format. Before we get started, Jason, do you want to talk a little about this VMware company nobody's ever heard of? Okay, no, we don't need to do that. We'll skip that part because everybody knows who VMware is. But we do find we have to introduce Faction a little bit. Although we're doing tons of work in VMware Cloud on AWS, it's always nice to tell people a little bit about us. We've been around since 2009. We've got over 100 petabytes of storage under management. We run thousands of hosts with tens of thousands of VMs across 8 locations. And we do various things in terms of hosted private cloud, but also very heavily involved with VMware Cloud on AWS since we began. Have a number of interesting patents in the networking attachment space, which is how we do some magic things with multi-cloud. But really notably, one of the things I think is interesting about Faction is that we're one of the few folks in the VMware ecosystem who are both a premier VMware cloud provider partner, meaning we've been doing cloud services with VMware heavily for nearly a decade now. But we're also an Amazon Advanced Consulting partner. And that's really interesting because when it comes to VMware Cloud on AWS, we have found that a lot of our customers have a level of interest really not just in VMware Cloud on AWS as a place to run VMware workloads, but as a way to integrate that with some of the plans they have around Amazon native services. And so we always like to highlight the fact that we're really making strides on both sides of that equation.
And that's critical because a lot of our customers are, maybe they have the expertise in house, they've supported vSphere, they know how to operate it, but they're looking for that partner to help them leverage and maximize the potential of this combination of VMware and AWS and what we can do with native services within AWS.
Awesome. Jason, you want to kick us off by walking through some of these VMware Cloud on AWS basics?
Sure. So at most fundamental, one of the big questions is why choose VMware Cloud on AWS? Why not choose just native EC2 and try to migrate our VMs? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is likely most of you in the audience have a familiarity with vSphere. You've probably been supporting it for a decade. You've got training behind that and the expertise, and you know how to secure and manage your enterprise workload. And with VMware Cloud on AWS, we can take that same framework and know how to manage that hypervisor and run it in a hyperscaler, which is a very powerful capability. On top of that, a lot of the third-party tools that you've been using over the years will work inside VMware Cloud and AWS, so we don't have to learn a new skill set or change, what we're using for our backup practices or whatever that might be when we move into the hyperscaler. And one of the biggest ones is with VMware Cloud and AWS, we give you the ability to literally vMotion workloads into the cloud and have a layer 2 stretch, which means we can move VMs without having to re-IP, without having to refactor or anything like that, which is extremely powerful. And it also, when we've got tight deadlines or you've got an obligation to get a certain amount of the workload into the public cloud, using VMware Cloud and AWS can be that catalyst to help get it in there, and then it gives you that breathing room and time that you need to be able to refactor the applications that make sense and move things and utilize EC2 and RDS and S3 without that time crunch or the latency that's introduced if some of your workload moves but the rest is still on-prem. It really opens up some capabilities there.
Yeah, I can't really emphasize enough how many enterprises we've talked to where a number of years back, they kind of started in with a plan to kind of do a cloud migration. They had ambitious plans for moving workloads to AWS, and they've made some progress, but they may have made substantially less progress than they intended. And that's because, frankly, IT departments are doing a lot of things, and refactoring applications wholly can be a really time-consuming process. And the really tough thing is if you only move 5% of your apps, physically into the cloud, and the rest are in your data center that we would consider as on-premises, now you've created this latency between what you do in the cloud and what you're doing on-prem. The amazing thing about VMware Cloud and AWS as a stepping stone to the cloud is you can take your applications, move them into VMC, and now they are literally microseconds away from Amazon native services. So if you have your traditional VMware apps that are running in that platform, and you have a bunch of Amazon Cloud native apps, those are now directly connected to one another, high speed, low latency. And that really just allows you to completely change the way you think about migrating to the cloud.
Absolutely. And that's something we'll talk about when we talk about the architecture.
Awesome. So speaking of, that integration with Amazon, one of the things we mentioned on here is, the access to those AWS native services. So, the connection between the VMware Cloud and AWS footprint and the Amazon native footprint means you can actually do things like use Amazon's load balancer in front of your VMware-based workloads. You can have web services that you're delivering from VMware Cloud and AWS servers on the VMware platform that then go through CloudFront as a content distribution network to seed out to your users. Those types of integrations are powerful, easy, and they let you take advantage of a lot of those native public cloud PaaS and SaaS services without having to move everything cloud native on day one to get the job done.
Absolutely. And like from a backup perspective, everyone likes the cost of S3, but there's normally a cost associated with pulling data out. And because of the integration that we have with AWS, we can ride what's called that ENI or Elastic Network Interface to be able to connect into S3 and pull backups out of that. So now they live outside of the SDDC, and we don't have the egress charges that we'll talk about when we get into that.
Yeah, and of course, VMware's kind of future-proofed this too, because it's not just vSphere and vCenter running on top of VMware Cloud and AWS. There's good integrations here to be able to deploy containers as well as VMs on VMware Cloud and AWS. So as your team start to kind of transition, they have a lot of options in terms of whether they want to run things on the VMware hypervisor, on AWS Cloud Native, whether they want to use VMs or containers or both. Just a lot of choices in that ecosystem, which is great. So what we're going to cover, I think, the main use cases here that we really see having the biggest traction with VMware Cloud and AWS today. And we can kind of trade off here. I think the first one here, which is data center extension, is one of those things that we always thought about hybrid. Classically, people started thinking about hybrid cloud bursting, and just being able to kind of take your existing data center footprint and extend that into the cloud was a powerful use case. But really, VMware has done this really much better than anybody else has because of the layer 2 extension that Jason mentioned earlier, and the ability to move workloads back and forth. You have a pair of tools that allow you to take your existing on-premises networks, match those networks one for one in the cloud, so you can actually have VMs that go back and forth without having any configuration changes whatsoever and actually run correctly in both places. And that's an amazing capability that takes the kind of idea of data center extension and really turns it into a reality.
Absolutely. And data center extension has been one of the primary use cases that we've seen for VMware Cloud and AWS since we launched the service in August 2017. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the host types and whatnot, but it's definitely been one of the primary use cases of these four.
Yep. So another one that's really near and dear to my heart really is around disaster recovery. And this, of course, makes sense. We've seen at Faction tons of interest in disaster recovery to the cloud over the years. And previously you really had to choose, I think, between did you want a really compatible environment that was guaranteed to have a low RTO, turn up your VMs in a compatible way, run really quickly like you would with a VMware target, or did you want to recover to the cloud and have all those geographic regions? Did you want to have the scale of the public cloud behind you, that kind of thing? With VMware Cloud AWS, you kind of get the best of both worlds. And actually, I will go ahead and plug this. A few months ago, you can find this on the Faction website. We actually did an extensive webinar all around disaster recovery to VMware Cloud AWS. So if you end up being really interested in that use case, you definitely want to check that out.
Absolutely. And when we talk about things like disaster recovery, we'll also talk about where Faction really fits in that and how disaster recovery can really be augmented by Faction's capabilities that are unique and that really open up that use case. Because when we talk about what the architecture for VMware Cloud and AWS looks like, it's a hyper-converged architecture. And so having the ability to attach a data store for decoupled storage is really powerful. And we'll talk about that a little later.
Yep. Of course, cloud migration. Now we're talking about a use case that we touched on earlier, just when we were talking about how easy it was to kind of execute on that, cloud transformation plan. The nice thing here is it used to mean that if you wanted to shut down a VMware-based on-prem environment and go to the cloud, it really meant taking all of your applications, identifying compatible instances, testing that, moving everything into completely new operating system instances, reporting those over with software tools. It was just complicated. It was fraught with a lot of potential challenges. But what we've all experienced as folks in the VMware ecosystem for a while, how easy it is to take a VM and move it from one VMware environment to another. And if it runs in one, and you have the same compatible networking on the other, you're pretty much going to run it exactly the same way. Because VMware is providing that, cloud migration becomes practically trivial and aided by tools like the hybrid cloud extender, which we'll talk about. It just becomes really easy because you can actually continuously replicate VMs up into the cloud and then just kind of fail them over with a click of a button.
Absolutely. It doesn't get much easier when you don't have to change hypervisors to move that workload. It also sets you up that all of us in IT know that we don't necessarily know the direction that IT is going to take 5 years from now. And knowing that, when it comes to trying to move into any public cloud, whatever it is, there's a lot of work that goes into that, a lot of professional services engagements. And let's say that, one of these hyperscalers becomes a competitor and you decide 5 years from now, you need to pull everything back home. There's a chance you're going to have to go through that same amount of work to try to change that application again to get it into a new home. And with VMware Cloud and AWS, we're giving that cloud migration capability with the versatility of knowing that you can move it back into your on-prem environment, into a partner data center, into another cloud, wherever we need to take that workload without the additional heavy professional service engagement.
Yep. I'm going to throw this out there real quick for everybody who's kind of asking some questions. We will get to some Q&A. If you're asking in the chat, I would direct you to use the Q&A button for questions because that way we can track those and make sure that we've answered those. So definitely throw your questions, like about version constraints, for example, into that Q&A, and we'll definitely address these as we get there. Last thing here is this just cloud integrated apps, which of course, the ability for us to integrate those VMware applications with all those AWS native services is incredible. And we have an entire webinar that actually Jason and myself did just about a month ago, where we talked extensively about this. We went through probably 6 different use cases. We talked about leveraging CloudFront, about leveraging Elastic Load Balancer, about a whole bunch of other services that you can use. So really great resource for you to check out if you're wondering, hey, how do these things fit together? We spent basically a whole hour talking about those integrations. So we're going to take a little break here. Maybe we will answer a couple of questions here while we get you guys to answer which of these use cases you think is the primary fit for your organization for VMware Cloud AWS. So I will go ahead and actually poke at that version question that I saw real quick. Somebody said, are there version constraints? You must be at 6.5, and you're exactly right. So for a lot of the extension things, 6.5 was the version that you need to have. So for example, if you want to use hybrid linked mode, so that you can have a single pane of glass for your VMware Cloud vCenter and your on-prem vCenter, just have them show up almost like two resource pools. 6.5 is the version that you need. Going forward in the future, there will be less of a strict version compatibility, but 6.5 was the version that became available as VMware started building out VMware Cloud AWS. One of the amazing things about VMC, by the way, in general, from my perception, is VMware is actually doing a lot faster release cycle. As opposed to those annual releases we get used to with VMware, VMware's been actually rolling out features kind of as they become available, disaggregate. And they have these milestone releases that are roughly quarterly, but they don't even necessarily wait to release features on those milestone releases. It's truly become like a real cloud service where innovations are kind of coming to end users as they happen, which is fantastic.
And on that note, so from a VMware perspective, one of the things that we've committed to is that inside VMware Cloud and AWS, we're always going to be on a kind of a cutting edge version, right? We have the ability to be pretty agile as far as the development cycle, but we know that on-prem may not have the same luxury. So we have committed to an N-1 model where you don't necessarily have to be on the latest, greatest cutting edge in order to be supported and be able to use things like hybrid cloud extension, which technically supports back to 5.0 that we'll talk about. But for more importantly, like hybrid linked mode, being able to connect those vCenters, that's why you see 6.5 as the supported version. Likewise, when we go to the next version of vSphere, we'll likely still support back to 6.5, but we've committed to supporting at least one rev back from whatever the next version is.
All right. Thanks for answering the poll. Really interesting distribution of use cases here. It seems like there's actually a lot of diversity in the use cases that people see. So let's talk really quickly about where VMware Cloud on AWS is available, because one of the amazing things here is, it started off running in Portland and went to Reston during general availability. Now VMware has been adding new regions at an incredible pace. Jason, you want to talk about the expansion?
Absolutely. When it comes to the expansion of VMware Cloud and AWS, we have a goal to be in every major region that AWS operates by the end of 2019, as we see on this map. And we've continued to hit the new expansion quarter after quarter, as you see from the available regions that we've got today and the ones that have just come online. And we just continue this trek towards being in all of the available regions of VMware Cloud and AWS. Now, on that note, AWS custom builds all this infrastructure, so they're going as fast as they can as well as we build out this infrastructure. So there are going to be times like the new R5 hosts that we're going to talk about. Those ones today aren't in every single region. So specifically when we talk about all the available regions, that's for the i3 host today. The R5 has a little bit more limited subset, and that's something we can delve into more detail on when we have those conversations one-on-one.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's actually kind of mirrors a lot of what Amazon does. As everybody knows, AWS native services are not universally available in every region. And there's plenty of services that are universally available. But of course, what's interesting is, since so much of what VMware is doing is in software, I think the R5 is the only feature that is regionally dependent today. So we're going to have a little basic view here of what the architecture of VMware Cloud and AWS looks like. And this gives you this high level view of how the pieces and parts fit together. So on the left-hand side here, you see your private cloud environment powered by VMware today, right? So you have your own vCenter or vSphere hosts in your own data center or a cloud provider. So then you've got VMware Cloud and AWS in the middle. Now you'll notice at the bottom here that the Amazon global infrastructure is underpinning all of this. So this is a VMware Cloud SDDC, but it runs on top of AWS bare metal hosts. Now the whole service, VMware Cloud and AWS, is completely sold, operated, and supported by VMware and its partners. So there's this great partnership with Amazon, but you're not going to Amazon to buy this, you're going to VMware to buy this. They're your support costs. You don't see any bills or charges from Amazon unless you're also using Amazon services. It all comes from VMware. And there's support today for both containers as well as virtual machines. And of course, one of the best things is, the flexible consumption model. You can get 1 year and 3 year or month to month kind of commits and get price savings if you commit to longer terms. But regardless of what you're doing in terms of term, you can always take the environment you have and rapidly scale it up. So it takes 6 minutes basically to add a host in VMware Cloud AWS, and it can be even faster with Elastic DRS. So the ability for you to go from a small environment to a much bigger environment is incredible. So that's really powerful. And it works exactly like your on-prem environment. So you're using the same vCenter, the same tool set that you used to get that same SDDC experience, which means that your team that operates a VMware environment today can pretty much jump up to speed immediately.
And on that note, one of the questions was, what kind of NSX experience do I need for this? Well, that's an excellent question, and it's one that's worth addressing. So, most customers have vSphere experience, but less are going to have vSAN and NSX experience, still given the fact that they're relatively new technologies in comparison. When it comes to what we can do in there, we have guides that are included, and that's one of the beautiful parts about using a partner like Faction is that they can help you with that portion of it. That said, from an NSX standpoint, you're using firewall policies just like you always have, but then it opens up the ability to use more advanced functionality like distributed firewalling that's built into NSX, but it's not mandatory that you use that functionality. It's just a better capability that's built in, and maybe that is that bridge that introduces you to NSX. You find the power of it, and ultimately you determine whether it's something you want to have exist in your on-prem environment as well.
Yeah, the way I'd like to put it really is that there's no requirement to have NSX to use the features and functions of VMware. But if you have made an investment in NSX for your on-premises environments, then that's fully compatible with also leveraging VMware Cloud AWS. So it's really up to you, kind of your level of involvement. But the features we're talking about tied to VMC do not require NSX on-prem. There are pieces and parts of NSX that VMware lets you deploy that you can download those pieces and parts, and they're included with the VMware Cloud AWS licensing.
Right. Hybrid Cloud Extension was developed independently of NSX, so it doesn't rely on some of the NSX capabilities to do that layer 2 stretch, vMotion, etc.
Yep. So in the bottom right-hand corner, I'm going to draw your attention to this arrow connecting this Amazon Web Services environment where you see the AWS icon into that VMware Cloud AWS square, right? Crossing that blue and orange box. So that extension between those two environments is where one of the most significant pieces of magic really is involved in this whole process. That interface, we call it an elastic network interface because that's Amazon's networking technology, but it allows the Amazon environment to get plumbed into NSX, is really powerful because what you're doing there is your VMware Cloud AWS networks where your workload VMs run. They have access to cross that bridge into Amazon native services so that they can talk to EC2 instances, so they can talk to relational database service instances, so they can deposit data into S3. So that they can use things, then you can turn around and use Amazon services like Elastic Load Balancer and pull those back into VMC. So amazing ability to integrate cloud native Amazon services with your VMware environment there. And I think that's maybe one of the most compelling things about the whole offering. So because we had this other webinar, I mentioned this earlier, but we had that webinar that strictly covers all of those native integrations. So definitely go and check that out. It's only about a month old now or so. So we're going to spend a little bit of time diving into the pricing and economics of VMware Cloud AWS. And if we haven't answered your question yet, don't worry, we have some time for Q&A that we'll get to at the end. So do you want to talk about pricing models, Jason?
Sure. From a VMware perspective, the options are on-demand, 1 year and 3 year reservation. And these are a mix and match. So let's say that we determine that full-time, you guys need 5 hosts for capacity and utilization for production workloads, but you want to be able to burst up when you're doing different test dev models and say burst up to 8. Those additional hosts could burn on demand versus the 1 year term, because the reason you do a 1 year or 3 year reservation is because of the discount that you gain. A 1 year reservation has a 30% discount, a 3 year reservation has a 50% discount. When you're going through VMware Direct, those are the only options to you, on demand, 1 year, 3 year. The monthly option comes available as something exclusively from a partner like Faction, giving the capability to essentially offer that piece of it. Otherwise, you're going through your own financing mechanism.
Yeah, and what we've really done is we've taken some of the VMware offerings and kind of allowed you basically to come to us to get still good pricing, but actually be able to pay for that on a month-to-month basis. So for organizations that don't want to have to, field that, upfront bill where you're paying for all 3 years committed upfront, we have some options around that to make that a lot easier for you.
And that is an important note, because with the 1 year and 3 year reservation, those are billed up front, generally speaking. when we're not having factions offering for a monthly billing cycle.
Yep.
Now, the supplemental on-demand for like egress charges, public IP consumption, site recovery as a service, those are the incrementals that would be billed on a monthly basis. The 1 and 3 year term is generally referring to the entire host that we're committing to and obtaining that discount for.
Yeah, and then the hybrid loyalty program is another, thing that VMware has thrown in here that really makes this just an incredible deal for existing VMware customers to extend and expand into VMware Cloud AWS. Basically allows them to get discounts anywhere between 10 and 25% based on the existing VMware investments they've made on-prem. So if you have vSphere, if you have NSX, if you have vSAN, that basically entitles you to even additional savings on VMware Cloud AWS. So it can be just an amazingly competitive offering. And then even more so when you start looking at that additional savings for already being a VMware customer.
And an important note on that when we talk about the hybrid loyalty program, there was a question about licensing. Inside VMware Cloud and AWS, when we talk about the costs, that includes the vSphere, vSAN, core NSX capabilities. Those are all part of the cost. We're not consuming any of the licensing for those components that you have on-prem. The hybrid loyalty discount allows you to continue using those licenses on-prem. You just get an additional discount for having current SNS on those. And when we talk about other licensing mechanisms for third-party products, be it OS licensing or whatever else it might be, just understand this is a single tenant environment when we talk about this, meaning the hosts are dedicated to you. So that opens up the ability to bring your own licensing rather than SPLA licensing, which is often a requirement in a multi-tenant cloud environment, which can be extremely powerful when we're looking at cost analysis and comparing costs to VMware Cloud and AWS versus refactoring into EC2, one of those cost considerations.
Yeah, it's amazing how it combines the best of two worlds, right? You have that true dedicated environment where all of your workloads are on isolated physical hardware powered by VMware. But because they can take hosts from that pool of Amazon hardware and scale that SDDC up in minutes, you're really getting all the flexibility of that public cloud experience, being able to kind of be completely elastic. Over the years, I've just had so many customers I've worked with at different roles where we've been architecting for just enormous capacity burst use cases, right? Seasonal things, processors that were busy during tax season or during Black Friday, those sorts of things. The ability to add a ton of cloud capacity to a VMware environment really was always something that people were super interested in. And this really delivers the kind of best availability version of that. And it's kind of amazing the use cases that it unlocks for a VMware environment. We're going to pause for a second, let you guys take the next poll here. So we're going to just talk about what kind of pricing model you prefer. And obviously, you're weighing off, would I rather pay for it as I go and pay higher versus would I rather get a discount from a long-term commitment? Yeah, so somebody asked when we were talking about contract, is it a specific time or monthly or what? So in terms of, the VMware sales, that on-demand versus 1 year versus 3 year, the terms are the 1 year and 3 year, and you actually pay for that capacity up front, and then you have those hosts available to you for the entire term that you've paid for. So let's say you bought 5 hosts on a 3 year term, you now have the ability to use those 5 hosts in an SDC indefinitely. And of course, it covers for things like hardware failure. If a host dies and it's replaced, it's just still one of your 5 hosts. And likewise, if you choose to add on-demand hosts, like Jason mentioned, if you're using 5 and you add on 2, say for a burst workload or for some extra test dev cases, whatever that may be, you pay the on-demand only for those additional 2 hosts, and the 5 are still included in your term along those lines. From a faction perspective, we have flexible term models. Ours are typically 1 and 3 year as well. But in our case, we're actually doing monthly billing on those terms, so we can kind of mix some of the flexibility of discounts for longer term commitments with still accepting monthly payments. Somebody asked a great question, which is just how many nodes is the minimum? Today it's 3. We're going to mention this on a slide later, but there is a roadmap item where VMware is developing a 2-node cluster as the minimum.
Correct. And in the interim, there's actually a promotion with 3 nodes for the price of 2. So when we talk about that, that's a big component as well. And I think we'll get to that.
All right. We're going to have some more stuff coming up, and we're going to hold more of the questions for the end because I think a lot of these questions will be answered as we go through this. Just in terms of a quick pricing scenario, we've got a little view here on, actual costs. It's hard to translate this into a workload. But what I will say is this. VMware has published some extensive total cost of ownership TCO models around VMware Cloud and AWS, and I've looked at them. And as a person who's been working for many private cloud providers and integrators, as well as a former VMware person myself, I was impressed right from the start and continue to be impressed with today about how incredibly economical this service is. This service was meant to replace folks' on-prem data centers. It was meant to be a true competitive version where people do not need to do it themselves anymore. And I completely agree that it meets that criteria. When you look at the savings you can have, obviously building a data center, buying hardware, operating it yourself is itself a 3+ year commitment. If you look at what your costs are in a 3-year commitment to VMware Cloud and AWS, especially when you think about how many things VMware does for you, because they're doing all the maintenance, all the patching, all the provisioning, all the procurement, all the networking, all those sorts of things. When you look at that total cost, it's incredibly competitive to just the idea of doing it yourself. So I was super impressed with that. So not to dive too far into the math of where these things go, but I will say that if you work up the TCO, I think everybody here would be equally impressed.
Yeah, and it's an important thing that we'll talk about. This example talks about 7 hosts. Again, the starting point's 3 today. But it's also important to note this is one of those huge differences between VMware Cloud and AWS and using like native EC2. With native hyperscalers, you had the ability for your developers to swipe your credit card and start for a few dollars a month. And that was very advantageous for them getting started. With VMware Cloud and AWS, we're dealing with entire hosts at a time. The advantage there is you're not buying per VM where you may have wasted resources because you can't pool all the resources. With VMware Cloud, we're doing the same thing that we do on-prem with giving the ability to oversubscribe and set limits and reservations for your CPU and RAM consumption, allowing for a more efficient consolidation of your workload, and oftentimes coming out extremely cost competitive and advantageous depending on workloads. However, the drawback to that is we can't start with 5 VMs. It's not economical to have a handful of VMs. We need to be able to fill the capacity of at least 2 hosts for this to make sense.
Sure. All right. You want to talk through this sort of curve?
Sure. When we look at moving into a hyperscaler, there's an exceptional cost on the front end, and oftentimes this is overlooked. I've talked to multiple customers that, they have an initiative. I'll use one customer in particular. It was oil and gas, and they had an MBO. They needed to get to the public cloud. They were moving into AWS. Their initial, first year forecast, they needed to move 400 VMs, and they moved the first 25, and it was great. And they were moving at a pretty good click, and they got 50 VMs moved in the first month. Everything was looking good. And then they hit a wall, and the migration cost bubble really hit them as far as what it took to try to refactor that application and efficiently get it into EC2, break it into new 12-factor type application. And they realized there was no way they were going to hit their MBO objective to get migrated those 400 VMs in a year. And when we talk about VMware Cloud and AWS, we smooth that bubble because there isn't all that upfront work and there isn't the challenge of trying to refactor that application. We have the ability just to move it in there. And again, provided we've got the number of VMs to support the host count requirements, this comes out extremely compelling. And again, it comes out more cost effective. And that same customer, we determined because of the ability to oversubscribe limits and reservations, we were quite a bit more cost competitive than going native EC2. And so not only did we manage to meet their MBO objectives, being able to vMotion, hundreds of VMs a week versus literally a handful is what they were down to when they came to us. But on top of that, they didn't have to go through all that architectural work to try to change it. We didn't need the expertise in-house to run the security group policies within native AWS, because when it comes to VMware Cloud and AWS, all the firewalling and everything is done in an NSX framework. And if we're not consuming AWS services, we don't have to do anything on that side of the fence. It really comes into play over there when we're consuming both sides.
Yeah, and because this is a real VMware environment and it's subject to things like overcommitment and other things that VMware environments are capable of, that really changes the economics for some folks as well. So quick view here, just thinking about, how fast this really can be adopted, right? Looking at the fact that you actually have this ability to get started and kind of kick the tires on a single host config. So What's interesting is in order to kind of maintain operational consistency, the single host environments are limited to 30 days. So you basically can turn one host up. There's an extra discount, so that you can kind of use that as a POC environment, pay as you go. And you can click a button anytime to scale it up to the full size cluster. But it's one of those things where you can only use it really for the tire kicking because it has that 30-day clock ticking and then it's going to end up deprovisioned. But it's still something where if you're interested in this today and you're thinking, how do I get started? You have this ability to really get going quickly. And actually, Faction is engaged with some customers with POCs where we're actually helping them do some of that onboarding, where we help identify some candidate workloads, do some migrations. We have a whole program based to kind of help people get into an environment really fast and do a more holistic evaluation. So let's talk a little bit about some of the technical highlights behind VMware Cloud AWS. And I think this will cover some of the questions that we've gotten so far in terms of what this looks like under the hood. So every one of the VMware Cloud AWS i3 metal hosts is a 2-socket, 18 cores per socket for 36 total as a physical host. That's per host, with that 3-host minimum normally in a cluster. Each one has 512 gigabytes of RAM. There's 8 SSDs per host, of which I believe 2 are for caching and 3 are for capacity. So you end up with a full vSAN environment spread across those hosts. And then you have this ability basically, of course, to scale that up on demand. But somebody asked at some point about hard drives versus SSDs, were there variable prices? And aside from the 2 host types, the i3 Metal and the R5, those are the only 2 host chargers. There's no other differentiation really from a host type perspective. You can't opt for hard drives instead of SSDs in these. And it's not just SSD, by the way. These are lightning fast NVMe drives in these hosts. So interesting thing here is, of course, the usable capacity in storage. And of course, it varies depending on your level of fault tolerance, whether you're using RAID 5 or RAID 6. I think a good rule of thumb to use is that at scale, you're going to get about 7 terabytes of truly usable storage per host. That means accounting for the overhead of vSAN, for the free space it wants to keep clear, accounting for things like dedupe and compression efficiencies, accounting for the fact that you've got fault tolerance. 7's a good rule of thumb that'd be in keeping with qualifying for service SLAs and things of that nature. So there's a lot of variance here depending on which one you've picked, but for a real production workload, 7's a good rule of thumb. And then, Jason, you want to cover the R5 Metal, which is the new host type that's available.
Sure. This was a joint collaborative effort between AWS and VMware. We spent about a year developing this, and we re-architected with AWS how EBS works. And effectively, these EBS volumes are presented as local vSAN storage inside each of the hosts. This is purchased inside the VMware vehicle. It's not something that's purchased or paid for separately in AWS native. And when it comes to the capacity, what this allowed for with the R5 hosts, they're dual 24 core and 768 gigs of RAM instead of 18 and 512. So 50% more CPU, 50% more memory. With EBS GP2, which is their SSD storage, we end up with about 300% more capacity than the i3 host. So this allows us to have more capacity per host and help drive down costs a little bit when using this local internal storage. Now, one of the give and takes of this is with this EBS storage, it's got about a third of the performance of what you see out of those NVMe drives. Those NVMe drives are just screaming fast. One thing that is gained is with the R5, we can always maintain a RAID 5 rather than having to go RAID 6. Because the storage is decoupled, if there's a host failure, we can just reattach the storage volume, which is advantageous. However, when we come into sizing and guidance, oftentimes we're going to look at what we need from i3, what we need from R5, and then we'll talk about what Faction could do with their storage offering, allowing for different tiered storage. Because the R5 solution is neat and it's continuing to be developed. But today, you get 300% more storage, but it costs about 250% more in the i3 host. So it's not necessarily effective when we're just doing R5 hosts for that storage capacity.
Yeah, great point there. I think when you look at the R5 usable, one of the things that we found is they're larger hosts to begin with, so they can have more storage capacity, but they're also 50% larger hosts to start. So from a ratio perspective, they're delivering more storage, but not necessarily enough to satisfy all users, but definitely more per node and kind of per gigabyte of memory in terms of ratio than an i3 does. Without going into like too much of the math though, I'm going to jump in real quick and talk about the Faction Cloud offering because it does something fairly unique that we've been able to bring to the market to really make it easier to size VMware Cloud environments with a little bit more flexibility. So a Faction Cloud control volume runs off of Factions platforms, and we're operating in major locations where VMware Cloud on AWS is available: Portland, Reston, Santa Clara here in the United States, London in the EU, with Frankfurt coming online soon. And we take our platform, and what we do is we can present storage into VMware Cloud on AWS that it mounts as another data store. So then you see your vSAN data store locally that's produced from those existing drives, and then you also have this additional capacity that Faction can add on. So we're able to take potentially as much as hundreds of extra terabytes and present that to VMware Cloud AWS to be consumed. And this is one of those things that's really made, Faction's one of the leaders in the VMware Cloud AWS space because we've kind of solved this problem of people wanting to add on a lot of extra storage, use different tiers, and that sort of thing. And so that's a kind of powerful Faction capability that we're able to bring. Let's pause for 1 second here, actually, and not talk about this. So the hosts here, 3 hosts minimum, that's 1.5 terabytes of RAM. So of course, that's pretty much today where people are starting. And then when we see the 2 hosts come out, that would make 1 terabyte of RAM. We'll take a quick poll for people of how large, is that too large of a starting footprint? We'll just keep talking while we're letting people vote on this poll. And we'll talk a little bit about the model here for accessing VMware Cloud AWS. So we have mentioned that this is the same vCenter experience that you have, but there are some differences here where you're not actually having quite the same level of access you would if you had to install, configure, and maintain vSphere yourself because VMware is doing that on you. Jason, you want to walk through this?
Yeah. So it's important to note that no matter what, VMware is the root admin in this environment. VMware does all the patching, maintenance, and upgrades to the stack. Now, this is a huge advantage because it really moves you into a SaaS model where that obligation is no longer on you. But as part of that, it means that your delineation is cloud admin or below, and that is documented. And what that means is you're not, no custom Viv installations, you're not rooting into the hosts. And when it says no direct management VM access, that means you're not getting directly into the VCSA appliance, the NSX controllers, but you still have vCenter access, you still have NSX control. But because of the fact that we're managing the stack, you will see it. It's not multi-tenant. So when you log into the vCenter, you will see a management resource pool, and you'll see all the VMs that comprise your SDDC, but they're all in a read-only state. The rest of the stack, everything that's in the compute resource pool and any child resource pools that you create within there, you effectively have admin privileges for that side of the workload, but we manage the rest of it.
Yeah, makes sense. And it really is actually super easy to get into. There's a portal you log into. It has an easy way to configure your access to the vCenter, and then it'll actually provide a little button you can click to copy the password, and you log right into the vCenter that you know and love today. So in terms of VMware HCX, we're going to talk a little bit about this because it really is the tool that provides like easy application mobility. And probably all of us over the course of our careers interacting with VMware environments have had a chance to try to use one tool or another to try to move a workload from one place to another. And HCX, or Hybrid Cloud Extender, is really done something unique here in the sense that it allows you to replicate the data underlying a VM over time. Almost you could think of it as a vMotion, but one where rather than moving all of the storage at the moment where you do the vMotion, it's like a shared nothing vMotion where all the storage and all the data for your VM is pre-seeded into the target environment, whether you're moving back or forth. So that's a really powerful capability in terms of being able to migrate.
And it's got compression and dedupe built into it, which dramatically decreases the amount of time it takes to move a workload. This is included with the service, and we can do a bulk migration in which we do a cutover, or we can do a vMotion if we do a layer 2 extension. And again, it can do all of this without having NSX on-prem. That's not a requirement. Now, if you want to move back and forth, we do need you on distributed switching. But even if you're not on Enterprise Plus, we have the ability to do it with a standard switch. It's an extremely powerful tool that's included with the service.
Yeah, and you could just think of it as something that really enables that kind of vMotion-like experience just underneath the hood technologically, makes it a lot quicker, faster, and easier. So really interesting thing here, we're going to talk a little bit about the automated cluster remediation, because this obviously, VMware is managing the service. What happens if there's hardware failures in that environment? So think about these hosts here, and if you end up having to swap a host out if there's a failure, as you can see in our little animation here, basically VMware automatically can get a new host from the pool of hardware that Amazon supplies. They can configure it to match your cluster configuration, pull that into the cluster, and then swap in a completely new host. And then they can obviously deal with the hardware aspect online. And having that, large cloud provider sized pool of hosts, backing your environment is really great, and takes obviously a huge amount of work off of a team, not having to manage that.
Yeah, we effectively get to treat the hosts like cattle. So on-prem, you always have to run an N+1 model. You always have to account for if I have to put a host in maintenance or if I have a hardware failure, it's going to take me days or weeks to replace that host. Inside VMware Cloud and AWS, if we have a problem with a host, we identify it in about 15 seconds. We can inject a new host in a few minutes, and you're back at full compute within minutes, kind of changing the equation that if your limits and reservations allow for it, you don't have to build in the same N+1 resiliency model that you would on-prem, which can help drive down costs as well. And that's all managed and monitored by VMware as part of the service. And when we have a maintenance event, we add an additional host to your cluster, be it for scheduled maintenance or a problem with the host, that's all included as part of the service at no additional charge.
Yeah. So we'll talk really quickly about Elastic DRS, which is a really interesting feature that basically allows you to get that same functionality that allows them to add hosts to the cluster and now have that essentially create auto scaling. So of course, everybody knows what DRS is. That allows VMware to kind of distribute your workloads across the hosts in your cluster for kind of the best performance. But what happens if instead of just being limited to redistribution of workloads on your cluster, what if it could grow your cluster? And that's essentially what VMware has created with Elastic DRS, the ability to kind of use different metrics for storage consumption and for CPU and memory consumption, and actually scale up and then scale down without any human intervention, which is a really powerful capability. It's kind of bringing VMware all those benefits of the elasticity of the cloud in a way that's really accessible to folks used to VMware environments today.
Yep, and it's optional if you wanted to enable it for CPU and RAM utilization, or if you wanted to strictly control that. This is for those bigger shops that have DevOps and want to make sure that when their developers need resources, that the resources are available to them. Because we all know that the biggest catalyst is somebody internally in your organization complaining about access to things, and so this really alleviates that. Yeah. From a storage standpoint, though, it is a requirement to maintain the integrity of the vSAN array. We do require that if you hit 75% of this consumption number, that we automatically add a host to maintain integrity. And there's plenty of notifications that roll out as that percentage comes near.
Yeah, and it does mean though for CPU memory, if you disable Elastic DRS, now you can move to an overcommitment model, just like you could with physical hardware on-prem.
Yep.
So stretched clusters are interesting because they're a way that VMware has built, again, in partnership with Amazon, to have essentially clusters running in two different availability zones that actually stretch across, so that now you can actually have a complete availability zone failure and maintain your SLAs, have no loss of data, and immediately treat that almost like a host failure, even though it was an entire availability zone. Now you can actually have all those workloads come up immediately in the availability zone that survives. So really powerful layer there to generate just an amazingly resilient infrastructure architecture, kind of taking advantage of the fact that AWS has been running identical platforms across availability zones.
And for those that are familiar with vSANs, we're running vSAN fault domains in two availability zones in, say, a region of Virginia. And what this is extremely powerful for are those institutions, financial institutions, healthcare, et cetera. It's literally a checkbox to enable this, but it does have, cost considerations that we would talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. For people who absolutely do not want to be down, though, it's really interesting that this whole architecture is available just as a turnkey deployment model. In terms of hybrid operations, not a lot to cover here, but I just want to point out that VMware Cloud AWS links to your on-premises environment. And as you can see here, you are seeing both a VMware Cloud and AWS vCenter on the top, as well as a on-premise VMware environment down below. And this ability to kind of have both of those accessible from the same pane of glass, actually tie your authentication back to your same authentication domain as on-prem for consistency, and use those same users, and then easily move workloads back and forth is an amazing capability here. And it's just all kind of built into the service. So disaster recovery, and this is actually one of the most popular use cases that people voted for. And again, I'm going to mention that we did a webinar maybe 2 months ago specifically about disaster recovery to VMware Cloud AWS. So definitely check that out if this is of interest. But using VMware's site recovery service, you have this ability to basically fan out or fan in, going from your on-prem site out to multiple DR sites, including VMware Cloud AWS. Powerful there, of course, because it's a great match to pair the flexibility and scale of VMware Cloud AWS and that ability to scale up on demand with the DR use case. And in this case, the site recovery portion works just like VMC in the sense that it's automatically deployed by VMware, automatically maintained and scaled, but is completely compatible with Site Recovery Manager on-prem. And if you don't have Site Recovery Manager on-prem, the licensing for the on-prem components is actually included with the service too. So you just click a button to start activating that on VMC, and then you can actually download the things you need for your existing VMware environment to kind of set up that disaster recovery site. Automated runbooks.
And an important note to make here, when from a VMware perspective, when we're selling VMware Cloud and AWS, storage constraints are a heavy consideration. And from a DR use case, in order to utilize SRM, you have to have that data center storage, which without faction, that means you have to have enough hosts to support that storage capacity. And that can make the DR use case challenging if we need to do 20 i3 hosts versus 3 to have enough capacity. This is where faction can really shine with their CCVs, being able to have that NFS attached storage. Now we have the ability to do however many hosts that we need for those tier 0, tier 1 applications, be it 3 hosts, 5 hosts, whatever, and then know that we can scale up within minutes to the size that we need to hydrate to in the event of a DR event and have an affordable DR solution built on site recovery.
Yeah, certainly one of the things that faction customers have appreciated is just that fact that you can have that minimal size compute cluster that really just acts as that pilot light or warm environment for those hot VMs. And then we can pretty much attach as much storage as is necessary to catch those DR workloads, and then only have to pay for the added compute hosts when they're needed. So, the Site Recovery Manager capabilities, a lot of people I'm sure are familiar with these, but it's nice because you can fail over. You can immediately reprotect back to the site that you are failing over from as soon as it's available, or immediately. You can fail back. It's all seamlessly built in. When we do test cycles, we're always taking hundreds or thousands of VMs and actually failing them over, reprotecting them, failing them back, actually in fairly rapid succession. So it's interesting always to see, how amazingly easy it is to kind of move from one site to another and watch all those workloads go back and forth.
Absolutely.
All right. Just to kind of round things out here, we're just going to talk about a few roadmap items that are coming up on VMware Cloud AWS, things that are yet to be launched. And the way VMware classifies these things is there's basically 4 categories. Available, which is all the stuff that's out now, and you can go to VMware's roadmap site. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of features now in available. There's in preview, which is basically you can think of as a beta, right? So some of the more sophisticated VMware customers get involved with VMware to go testing some of these features. Faction does a fair amount of this ourselves. Developing, which means VMware has actually committed to that item and they are actually working on building it out and they're testing it and it's on its way. And then considering, which is basically roadmap items they've sort of formally acknowledged but are not actually in development but are kind of planned for future development.
And everything we'll be talking about today is in a planning phase that's listed on this. Now, one of the unique things about VMware Cloud and AWS is it's the first time ever VMware's had a publicly available roadmap. If you go to cloud.vmware.com in VMware Cloud and AWS, there's a roadmap tab, which is listed here at the top, that will give you the breakdown of all of these things. I've highlighted 4 key things that are in the planning stages because they're pretty important items I thought people would be interested in. Today, when we create an SDDC, we can vMotion from on-prem into the cloud and vice versa, but we can't today vMotion from one SDDC to another, say Virginia to Ohio. That's one of the things that's currently in development to be able to offer that capability. Next up is hybrid linked mode for multiple SDDCs. When we connect vCenters and be able to see your on-prem and your tertiary data center running inside VMware Cloud and AWS, we can use enhanced link mode. So if you've got 10 vCenters on-prem, we can connect those and see all of those in the one SDDC running in VMware Cloud and AWS. But if we have multiple SDDCs running in VMC, we can't link all those yet together. And then next, we mentioned there's the 3-for-2 promotion going for VMware Cloud and AWS for the host count, but coming up next is the ability to move that line down to a 2-host cluster versus 3, which will continue to lower that barrier of entry. And then lastly, there is a third host type coming beyond the i3 and R5. It's currently in the planning, but think of a kind of a merger of the two, gaining some of the, maintaining that NVMe performance while having deeper capacity and more CPU and RAM like the R5 host.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Super cool stuff. And, it's been a pleasure, of course, at Faction watching our own, integration with VMware with our cloud storage platform, kind of walk through those stages on this roadmap. So with that having been said, I'm going to cover real quickly the Faction portfolio here, just some of the things that we deal with, right? So Faction historically has provided hosted private cloud. And one of the things that we've noticed is that for a subset of our VMC customers, they've really needed to bring something like a bare metal box along with. And if they have things like a specific Oracle server that really needs a 2x4 processor configuration, or they want to bring an AS400 along, we've been able to actually put that and attach it across Direct Connect straight into their VMware Cloud and AWS environment. So if you're thinking, oh, we can't use VMC because we don't have any solution for XYZ, there's a decent chance that actually Faction can help out with that. And of course, VMware Cloud and AWS has turned into one of our core specialties. And in fact, if you're hearing things that interest you in this webinar, definitely reach out to the Faction team. We have dozens of specialists that can help you understand if VMware Cloud and AWS is right for you and how to proceed with the architecture and deployment of that. The Cloud Control Volume Platform is that basis of our being able to add on that extra storage to VMware Cloud. So that's a really powerful capability we have. It has a lot of other uses too, because it's inherently a multi-cloud platform as well. And we've actually been able to attach storage for some of our customers into both VMware Cloud and AWS, as well as AWS Cloud Native environments and other clouds, and that's powerful. Our disaster recovery services are fully managed DR, basically, that we can layer on top of VMware Cloud and AWS. So rather than having to kind of build and run it yourself, our team actually assists with doing the assessment, the deployment of a run book, the biannual testing, all those things that you kind of want basically done for you. So your team doesn't really need to be experts. And we're leveraging both our storage platform as well as VMware Cloud and AWS. And then finally, we deal with managed and professional services, right? All those things about migrating, deploying, sizing, architecting. We help customers integrate, networking components. And of course, one of the things that actually we specialize in is the fact that we've actually helped people with Amazon native service deployment as well. So keeping in mind that we're an advanced consulting partner with AWS, we've been able to do things like build out those hybrid environments, helping customers put load balancers and CloudFront CDN and other things in front of their VMware Cloud and AWS environments. And with that, we are ready to start answering some questions here in Q&A.
I think we've answered quite a few of them. There was 2 questions in particular I wanted to field over to you. One question was for DR, do you support RP for VM?
So RP for VM, we are not supporting it at Faction at this point. That's actually on our roadmap. But RP for VM does have compatibility with VMware Cloud and AWS, broadly speaking. Actually, I'd love to hear from people who are interested from using for RP VM, because we're actually going into the development cycle for that on some of Faction's managed services. So please reach out, get connected to me personally, and I'd be happy to talk with you about it.
And that's a Dell EMC technology for those that aren't familiar with the acronym.
Yeah. So somebody asked, Faction allows basically for colo beyond bullets that would, it says you would also mitigate egress charges for your data being stored in the colo. Yes. So for all the things that we're doing, that is like the cloud attached storage or those devices that we host in colocation, one of the things that you end up realizing is that if you put things outside of the bubble of Amazon's data centers and you attach them over the network, there are egress charges. So Faction always includes the network component of that in terms of the physical attachment and the logical attachment, but we don't cover egress charges. So just like you would be billed for Amazon Elastic IPs or internet egress charges associated with your VMware Cloud and AWS environment, those kind of build and arrears charges, Faction would also pass on the direct connect egress charges as well. So one of the things we worry about is when we do architecture with customers is what those kind of network topologies look like. Somebody said, if a business wanted to use this for DR and only wanted to DR certain critical VMs, is that a possibility? And the answer is absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you had 5,000 VMs on premises, but you only had a subset of 300 VMs you saw as business critical, you absolutely can select that subset and use that. So,
and SRM allows you to select specific drives within a VM as well. So if you've got a large mission critical VM, but maybe a big chunk of the storage is a DR backup, you do have the ability to isolate that out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody said, are there any performance issues for customers using Veeam as a backup solution, i.e. backup and restore time? What I would say is it's viable to use Veeam to back up and then restore into VMware Cloud AWS. You have to be careful about the architecture there. In terms of both how you deal with the SDC turnup and scaling, as well as where your Veeam data is being stored and the manner in which you restore it. But we are working with clients with Veeam as the kind of underlying solution. So I'd say if you're interested in doing kind of disaster recovery to VMware Cloud AWS with Veeam, definitely reach out to the Faction team. We can talk to you a lot more in depth about that and what that kind of process would look like and those sorts of things. Somebody asked, and maybe they came in a little bit late, they said, is there a limit to storage per host? And yes, every host has a very finite amount of storage that depends on the storage, the host type. So you've got your i3 and your R5 hosts. Each one has a limit. This is one of those things that Faction tends to solve for, is the fact that we have the ability to add a bunch of extra storage on as a data store that's shared between the hosts. So we can add, I want to say that if you're kind of using 7 terabytes as a guideline for an i3 metal host, you end up with something like 102 or so terabytes total that you can kind of use off of that. A little over 100 terabytes, basically, of total storage capacity at that point on the max 16 host cluster size. We're able to add hundreds of terabytes more to that, so we can grow the capacity enormously, both from a total maximum as well as from the ratio. So yeah.
And this is hugely cost advantageous, and this is one of those significant advantages that Faction brings to the table, given the fact that oftentimes opportunities are sized to storage when just using internal i3 storage. And when you have that need for deeper storage, but maybe it doesn't have the same need for NVMe level performance, Faction being able to offer that tiered storage solution that's decoupled from host count can have significant impact on your cost analysis for moving into the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. Somebody asked the question of how DNS management is kind of handled in terms of IP and network changes for VM migration. The interesting thing about migration with HCX and actually disaster recovery as well in this environment is keep in mind that VMware Cloud on AWS is powered by NSX, which means your network selections in terms of the IP addresses that you use inside of that network, they are completely abstracted, right? You can choose to have the exact same layer 3 subnets you have on-prem. In fact, one of the things our customers tend to really like about doing disaster recovery into VMC is they can match their on-prem IP addresses exactly. So it's kind of a neat capability in terms of not having to re-IP things. What we find is that some people, even though there's capability inside of site recovery to change addresses as you go, some people don't like having to rely on that because they have things at the application level that are hard-coded from an address standpoint. So being able to keep the same cost or IP address scheme as you move over is actually really powerful.
I think that's everything, right?
Somebody said, did I hear that VMs in the cloud would be read-only? No. I'm not sure where that kind of question came from, but I mean, it's a full VMware environment. So as you move VMs into the cloud, they're fully functional.
It's only the management plane that VMware manages that's read-only.
Oh, right.
For like the VCSA appliance and NSX controllers, but your compute workload is fully, you can do everything. You essentially have full admin capabilities within that, but the actual appliances that run the SDDC, VMware manages.
Yeah, and it's almost like read-only is maybe the wrong word, right? Because you interact with Site Recovery Manager as a VM just like you would with a Site Recovery on-prem. It's just that you're not responsible for deploying it or patching it or things, and so you don't need or have administrative access because VMware's orchestration handles that for you.
One of the last questions was if they're looking for support for a DR opportunity, do they contact Faction or VMware? You have a unique advantage on that one. You can contact either one of us and we can help you out. Faction can work with you directly, or your direct account team can pull in Faction. We can all work collaboratively. Either way, we're likely all going to work together to help foster that solution for you guys?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we do certainly work really tightly with the VMware team, on all of these deployments and opportunities. I will say, it's always nice in the sense that Faction, I think I can assertively say that we have helped more organizations do disaster recovery to VMware Cloud and AWS than anyone else. And I wouldn't put Jason on the spot and ask him to say that, but I feel confident at least asserting it from the Faction side.
Do we support Commvault? Yes, Commvault is fully supported. And if you go to, if you Google, VMware Cloud and AWS Solution Marketplace, you will find a marketplace we've listed with all these certified third-party products.
Yep. Somebody asked if we have use cases for healthcare, education, or transport sectors. Yeah, we can help you almost regardless of your sector. I will say that I think we've had, in terms of vertical resonance, we've had a lot of interaction with insurance, with financial, with oil and gas actually, but we have a lot of team members that are actually really focused on actually dealing with the healthcare industry right now. There's obviously a whole lot of additional complexities that go along there, although I will mention that Faction as a service provider with our platform, we actually also are HIPAA certified, have a HIPAA audit annually, and that we actually do sign BAs with customers. So we are able to kind of work with people who have those types of requirements for healthcare solutions. All right. Well, appreciate everybody sticking around, and I guess we'll hang out for another minute here. But for those of you who've joined us all this way, thank you for spending the time with Jason and I. We really appreciate everybody being on board. We hope you find VMware Cloud AWS as exciting as we do, and we look forward to hearing from more of you that are more interested in the service, because we'd be happy to talk more about your kind of specific needs and requirements.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.